My name is Evelyn Hartmann, and I am 71 years old. If you think life gets easier with age, let me tell you my story, because what happened to me will make you question what family really means. Backhand index pointing. Right before I continue, ask yourself this: if the people you sacrificed everything for suddenly turned their back on you, would you still keep helping them? Stick with me until the end, because my answer shocked even me. It all started on a Tuesday morning. I had just picked up the phone to call my son, Adrian, to ask when his wedding would be. I had my calendar ready, the pale lavender dress I bought hanging in my closet, and shoes polished, waiting for the big day. But before Adrian could even say a word, his fiancée Clara looked me straight in the eye with a chilling smile and said, "Oh, we already got married yesterday. We only invited special people." Those words cut deeper than a knife. Special people. I, who had paid their rent for 3 years. I, who had bought every stick of furniture in their home. I, who had filled their fridge when they had nothing to eat. I was not a special person. I stood frozen in my own living room, clutching the phone as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. My son Adrian avoided my eyes, while Clara made herself comfortable on the sofa I had bought for them with my pension savings. In my closet, the $200 lavender dress I had chosen for her wedding hung useless, along with the matching shoes, never to be worn. I had spent weeks planning the perfect outfit, imagining myself in the wedding photos that would never include me. For months, I had been saving $1,000 as their wedding gift. I had called my sister, Marianne, in Chicago to share the joyful news. I had scrubbed my house from top to bottom, preparing to host them after the ceremony. All of it collapsed with those 4 poisoned words: only special people. Adrian finally spoke, his voice oddly rehearsed. "Mom, it was an intimate thing. Just us and the witnesses." But I knew the truth. Because when I opened my phone later that night, I saw the photos on social media. Clara's parents stood proudly next to the bride and groom. Her siblings toasted with champagne. She wore a wedding dress I had unknowingly helped finance with the $800 I gave her for personal expenses. I saw everything I wasn't supposed to see. And for the first time I realized I had been erased. 1 week later, just 7 days after that humiliation, Clara called me again. But this time, her voice wasn't triumphant. It was desperate. "Evelyn, the rent is overdue. The landlord says if we don't pay this week, we'll be kicked out. You forgot to make the transfer." Her voice trembled as though the world was collapsing. I stayed silent. My mind replayed the countless mornings I had rushed to the bank to transfer money for their rent. The dinners I had skipped to ensure they had groceries. The $33,000 I had drained from my savings over the past 3 years to keep them afloat. And now, after excluding me from their wedding, they had the audacity to call me, expecting help as if nothing had changed. I took a deep breath and said calmly, "Clara, didn't I tell you? I only help special people." The silence on the other end was deafening. For the first time in years, it wasn't me trembling. It was her. That night, I sat on my bed and cried. Not out of sadness, but out of anger. Years of humiliation and neglect flooded through me. I wasn't crying for them, I was crying for the fool I had been. But when I woke up the next morning, something inside me had shifted. I looked in the mirror and saw the same tired wrinkles, the same eyes weighed down by sacrifice. But behind them, there was something new. Determination. That was the day I decided I would stop begging for love. I would stop financing a life where I was not welcome. And I would take back control of everything they had stolen from me, starting with my money. What I didn't know was that this decision would trigger a battle I never imagined, a war not for their rent, not for their comfort, but for my very freedom. Because Adrian and Clara weren't going to let go of their golden goose so easily. They had a plan, a dangerous one. The morning after Clara's desperate phone call, I brewed myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the dining table. But instead of setting out bills for their rent, or jotting reminders for their needs, I laid out my bank statements. For the first time in years, I wasn't calculating their survival. I was calculating the price of my own foolishness. Rent, $500 every month for 36 months. $18,000 gone. Groceries, $200 a month for 3 years. $7,200 gone. Birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries, at least $3,000. Clara's emergencies, doctor visits, prescriptions, urgent expenses, $800. The car loan Adrian promised to repay but never did, $2,500. Their broken air conditioner I paid to fix, $600. Furniture for their apartment, $1,200. When I totaled it, the number burned into my eyes. $33,400. $33,400. Not an investment. Not a loan. Just gone. It was the money my late husband, Walter, and I had saved for our retirement. The trips we dreamed of taking. The little cushion to make my final years comfortable. And I had handed it away, piece by piece, lie by lie, because I believed it would buy me love, gratitude, or at least a place in my son's life. Instead, it bought me invisibility. The phone rang. Adrian's name glowed on the screen. Once upon a time, that name would have made my heart skip. Now it only made me sigh. I let it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then silence. 10 minutes later, Clara's name appeared. I let that ring too. A message followed. Mom, please answer. We need to talk. Delete. For the first time, I wasn't their safety net. For the first time, I chose myself. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I put on my coat and walked to the park. It had been months since I had walked without a purpose, without an errand to serve them. I passed the swings where Adrian, as a little boy, used to laugh until his belly hurt. I remembered the child who hugged me tight after nightmares, whispering, "You're the best mom in the world." When had he grown into this man who treated me like an ATM with wrinkles? When had I started confusing money with love? I didn't have the answers. But I knew one thing, my story was about to change. The next morning, I walked into the bank. The branch manager, Mr. Keller, looked up and smiled. He had processed every transfer to Adrian and Clara for years, watching my account shrink with clockwork precision. "Mrs. Hartman," he greeted warmly. "Another transfer today?" "No," I said firmly. "I need to cancel all of them. Effective immediately." His smile faded. "All of them? Are you sure? After all these years?" "I'm sure," I cut him off. "And I want information on how to protect my accounts. No one else should have access to my money." For the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. As Mr. Keller processed the paperwork, my phone buzzed nonstop. Adrian. Clara. Adrian again. Almost as if they could feel the cash flow being cut off. I turned. When I slammed the door behind them, the silence that followed felt less like solitude and more like a landing, one that would either break me or set me free. I sat at my kitchen table with the leftover crumbs of a life I'd been feeding to other people. The man in the gray suit, Mr. Fisher, had left with a smile that promised trouble. Adrian and Clara had walked out with the wounded pride of people who believed they owned my life. My hands were still shaking when I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Evelyn Hartman," the voice answered, warm and unmistakable. "Mr. Lang, it's Evelyn. I need your help." He had been my husband Walter's lawyer. He had handled our will, the house, the small inheritance Walter left us. I had seen him as a steady lighthouse when the waters got rough. Today, I needed that lighthouse to cut through smoke and mirrors. Within hours I was sitting across from him in a walnut-paneled office that smelled of old books and honest work. I handed him copies of bank statements, digital transfer proofs, photos of the social media posts from their secret wedding. I told him, without pause, everything I had been ashamed to admit for years, the money, the favors, the nights I stayed up counting pennies so they wouldn't go without. Mr. Lang listened without interruption. When I finished, he rubbed his chin and said, "Evelyn, what they attempted at your house today is textbook elder financial abuse. They invoked the very language abusers use: concern, worry, we need to protect you. It's a legal path to strip you of control." "Can they do it?" I asked. "Declare me incompetent? Take my life away with a stamp?" "They can file a petition," he replied. "But it must be backed with evidence, medical evaluations, affidavits, and, importantly, your financial record showing irregularities you did not authorize. Which is the opposite of your case, you authorized everything." Relief washed through me. Not because I suddenly felt safe, but because the path to fight back was clear. Paper was their weapon, and paper could also be my armor. We made a list. Document everything. Gather witnesses. Request the records of any attempts to access my accounts. Change locks. Install cameras. Open a fresh account at a different bank where no one could even guess the name on the sign-up form. Update the will. And, delicate but vital, prepare for the possibility they would indeed take legal steps to seize control. Mr. Lang leaned forward. "We'll move fast. I'll draft a cease and desist, and we'll file declarations showing your competence and history of sound decisions. Do you have a primary care physician who can attest to your mental acuity?" "Yes," I said. "Dr. Morales. I see her every 6 months." "Good. I'll call her. Also, don't let them back inside your house uninvited. Change the locks today." I left his office with a folder thick with plans and a very grown-up fury. It surprised me how my anger had become a tool. Instead of hiding it, I used it. The phone off. "Mrs. Hartman," Mr. Keller said softly, "I don't mean to intrude, but I've seen you be incredibly generous. Please tell me, you're not being pressured into this?" His concern struck me harder than I expected. This man, who barely knew me beyond account numbers and signatures, was showing more genuine care than my own son had in years. I looked him straight in the eye. "No, Mr. Keller. For the first time, I'm not being pressured at all. I'm finally free." When I walked out of that bank, I felt taller, stronger, almost as if I had left 33,400 pounds of weight behind. But I didn't know, freedom would come with a price. That evening, as I returned home, I noticed 3 cars parked in front of my house. Adrian's, Clara's, and a third I didn't recognize. Through the window, I saw movement inside. Shadows. Figures. My blood ran cold. They had keys. I had trusted them with keys. I gripped the doorknob, my pulse racing. I knew, whatever waited inside would change everything. I pushed open the door. And froze. Adrian sat slumped on my sofa, his head in his hands. Clara paced like a caged lioness. At my dining table sat a man in a gray suit, rifling through my personal documents. My documents. My life. "What is happening here?" I demanded, louder than I intended. All 3 turned, startled. Clara spoke first, her voice dripping urgency. "Evelyn, thank God you're here. This is Mr. Fisher, from a law firm. We needed to talk about your situation." "My situation?" I repeated coldly. Adrian lifted his head, his eyes desperate. "Mom, the bank told us you canceled everything. Mr. Fisher is here to help. We're worried about you." Mr. Fisher stood, extending a hand I refused to shake. "Mrs. Hartman, I'm a family law attorney. Your children are concerned about your mental well-being. They asked me to assess the situation." I stared at the stranger in my house, at the stolen papers on my table, and a chill spread through me. This wasn't about worry. This wasn't about love. It was about control. And in that moment, I understood the terrifying truth. They weren't just trying to guilt me into helping again. They were trying to take everything.
My name is Edmund Voss. My age is 72. I was told my life would quiet down after 45 years of marriage. Instead, in the hollow left by my wife's passing, I found a war waiting to be fought. If you've ever been underestimated or betrayed by someone you trusted, drop your city in the comments and hit like. This one is for you. When Evelyn died, the house smelled like lilies and hospital detergent. Grief draped over me like a heavy shawl. It changed how I moved, how I spoke, how the morning light fell through the curtains. They said time would heal, but I learned that time doesn't rush to mend the part of you that keeps your name on the front door. People trickled in with casseroles and condolences. They hugged me and promised to be there. They left. A week later, my son and his wife invited me to a meeting I had been trying to avoid. It's just to discuss some practical things, Leo said. Though in that new tone that did not belong to the boy who once smeared mud on his face and asked for bedtime stories. Isabella, she had always chosen crisp clothes as if armor and conversation as if inspection, arranged the meeting. She gave me that smile that never reached her eyes and called me by my first name as if stripping titles would make me smaller. The law office they brought me to could have been transplanted from another planet. Glass and chrome, a maze of soft leather chairs and polished tables, a showroom for ambition. I sat at one end of a table that looked built to host kings. They sat at the other with predatory composure. They had documents, neat stacks of paper that promised to make my life simpler by making it less mine. Transition, Dad, Leo said. We just want what's best for the company. He kept his eyes away from me, as if looking would remind him of the boy who learned to carve wood in the garage. Isabella slid the papers like a gift. The edges winked in the light, the sentences were designed to sound reasonable. The offer was not an offer, it was an ultimatum politely wrapped. I listened to them parse my life into clauses and conditions as though 45 years of partnership could be condensed into signatures. When Isabella used a word that tasted like vinegar, the old woman, it opened something in me cold and bright. I did not rise to the bait. Silence, I discovered, is its own language. I asked for time to consider. They smiled, convinced their momentum would bury me. They left with the arrogance of people who take for granted that grief equals surrender. But Evelyn had not left me defenseless. She had been a careful woman, a patient strategist even when the bright light of youth had dimmed. Her voice returned to me in scraps of memory, in the way she used to rearrange my pockets when she thought I wasn't looking, precise, tender, practical. She had always left notes in the oddest of places, a message tucked into a shoebox, an address scribbled on the underside of a recipe card. A plan, I thought, if she were the sort who prepared for storms. And I remembered a line she once said when our son brought home a woman who seemed too polished, watch how she treats the small things. You will know her by the way she closes doors. That night I found a number tucked into the pages of an old book, a number that belonged to David Crane, a man whose hands smelled of leather-bound ledgers and riverbank fishing lines. David had been a friend for years, a man who kept secrets the way some people kept religion. He had helped us with wills and assemblies and once, many years ago, had driven an old car with a dent near the bumper to get Evelyn back from the airport when the roads were icy. When his voice answered the phone, a calm steadied me in a way nothing else had. Edmund, he said, and there was an old softness in the tone. I suspected this might be coming. We met in the warmth of his study, where familiar books and faded photographs absorbed the cold edge of the world outside. He produced a box, no larger than a shoe case, and set it down like a relic. In that box were things that smelled of cedar and thyme. Letters, photographs, and a smaller sealed envelope that hummed with possibility. Evelyn's handwriting labeled the outer seal, her last instructions. She had prepared for everything she had feared. There was a will, rewritten and ironclad. There was a test result that could either heal or wound. There was, under the wax and the paper, a choice that belonged more to justice than to me. She had not sought to punish, she had sought to arm. I left David's house with the envelope like a weight in my pocket and a resolve in my chest. The road home was blurred by a rain that had a neatness to it, as if the weather itself were pressing the world into order. The city lights seemed unusually patient, the night, an audience. What I did not yet know, the first move in this slow game of chess would begin in daylight and would require a kind of cruelty I hoped I would never have to learn. The safe deposit vault was a cathedral of small doors. The air inside smelled of metal and recycled promises. David produced a key that clicked and sang like a talisman. When he handed the iron box to me, the weight of it was not purely physical. Inside, the will that made Evelyn's half of the company untouchable, placed into a living trust with me as its steward. Beneath it, an envelope sealed tight. My hand hovered. The choice to open it would change everything. It would clarify a childhood memory that had never quite fit, a nurse's offhand remark, a blood type noted in a file, a joke that had landed differently in Evelyn's ears and lodged there. There was a truth that could be medicine or poison. Evelyn had made it clear, powered tools were more useful in the hands of a man who could wield them without revealing his forge. I decided to keep the envelope closed. It was a blade best shown only when the right throat required it. We left the vault with a plan. The trust insulated half the business, the legal architecture made unsealing it pointless to a casual raider. David explained how the trust worked. Someone who had no idea of the architecture would see a property and a governing document and think the matter settled. They would not know the lock's key. That night, I walked the property we had built together. The house was a museum of small rebellions, a chipped mug that Evelyn insisted on keeping, a lopsided chair covered in yarn she had knit. It was full of her handwriting in the margins of old cookbooks, in recipes, in addresses, a life catalogued with the intimacy of a cartographer. I sat on the porch where she used to sip tea and talk about the absurdities of the day. I realized the battle ahead would not be about signatures alone, it would be about memories, stories, and the legalities that spin around them. In the morning, as if rehearsed, Leo and Isabella staged their first public moves. They visited the workshop and began making changes to meetings and staff rosters in ways they said were temporary management decisions. People in the company noticed small shifts, one supplier replaced by another, a meeting scheduled earlier than usual. None of it seemed sinister individually. Together, however, the changes threaded like a net. I watched from the office window, a spectator watching a familiar set change while the actors continued without acknowledging the audience. Each new policy was wrapped in language about efficiency and modernization. Isabella came to the plant on a weekday and had conversations with management that were fluent in corporate speak but barren of warmth. She had a way of making functional statements sound like inevitabilities. As they tightened their control, my mind wandered back to the sealed envelope. The power of an unknown truth is a terrible thing, it grows in the dark into monstrous possibility. I began to imagine scenarios that had nothing to do with reality, a courtroom battle that would drag. There would be more small battles. There would be tamped-down confrontations. And beneath them all, the envelope sat like a promise, a truth that would not be flung like a bomb but placed, precisely, into the hands of a man who required humbling. It began with a seemingly trivial incident, a piece of equipment gone missing for a day. Production hiccuped. The foreman shrugged it off, except he didn't. He had been my friend. His father had worked with me, too. When he came to me, agitated and whispering about a shift in culture, I felt the frost creep in. The changes at the company were no longer theoretical. They were personal, and they were creating friction among the people who kept the business alive. If Isabella thought she could walk in and replace devotion with directives, she was wrong. She had underestimated the intangible capital our family had amassed, loyalty, respect, tacit knowledge. But she had a weapon more insidious than directives. She had influence on my son, and she used it like a scalpel. Leo's eyes were cold in meetings, he took decisions that cost long-time employees their stations and left them scrambling. I started hosting small breakfasts in the workshop kitchen. I invited the old guard, the men and women who had been with us for 30 years. We talked about the company's early days, about mistakes and triumphs. I listened more than I spoke. Old memories are like magnets, they pull people back into alignment. The stories we shared were more than nostalgia. They were a web of belonging. On one of those mornings, Maria, who had been our office manager for decades, told me something that made the skin on my arms crawl. She had found a file, an email chain, where Isabella had proposed a restructure that would shutter a division Maria's brother ran. It was not just corporate maneuvers, it was targeted, precise, and vindictive. Someone had been doing background work. Compiling documentation, identifying pressure points. Isabella did not work in the open. She worked in shadows. That night, I opened Evelyn's sealed envelope. It was time to test whether the blade would cut or merely scare. My hands trembled as I slit the seal. Inside, a genetic report and a set of affidavits. The report read a way that made my breath hitch. It suggested that Leo was not my biological son. 1,000 memories rearranged themselves. Childhood dinners, scraped knees, the smell of cut grass, they were not erased by a line on paper. But I understood what Evelyn had intended. The document was not solely a revelation. It was leverage. It had to be used with wisdom, not with the raw fury of a man betrayed. I folded the paper and put it back in its envelope. At the same time, I felt a new clarity. The objective was not to publicly humiliate a man for whom I had given years of my life. The objective was to protect the business and the people who depended on it. Humiliation could break the machine entirely. Strategy would preserve it. So I did something different. I began to gather quiet allies, a retired partner who still held sway with key investors, a gentle but fierce HR director who could shepherd employee concerns, a solicitor who could challenge any illicit maneuver inside corporate governance. The idea was not confrontation for its own sake but preparation. We would build a shield around the firm and a path that respected the essence of what Evelyn had protected, the business as a living organism, not a commodity to be harvested. Isabella kept pressing. She requested meetings with major clients. She began a campaign of gentle destabilization, a rumor here, a late invoice there. The company's stock, which had been steady for years, began to tremble. But each tremor I countered quietly. I did not call her out in public. I refused to give her the spectacle she hungered for. Instead I used patience and precise pressure. When a client began to waver, I called them personally. When a supplier threatened to pull out, I found alternate routes. The day the first lawsuit papers arrived, I was sitting in the old woodshop that had been the company's heart. The suit was thinly veiled, claims of mismanagement, procedural irregularities, the kind of language crafted to look lethal but meant to be survivable. Leo's signature sat atop it like a stain. I did not burn with rage. I put the papers in a drawer and smiled a small, private smile. I knew where Evelyn had placed her strength and why she had chosen me to wield it. We were not unarmed. We had time, allies, and a sealed truth. But time can be treacherous. It gives people a chance to make irreversible moves while you calculate. Leo started cutting cords with people who might testify to the history and character of the company. He reassigned keys. He changed passwords. He began moving assets into shell structures. It was the behavior of someone who feared losing control. He had started to build an alternate reality where Isabella's designs would be unassailable. I watched the pattern and set another, softer trap. I leaked, with surgical care, a rumor that the firm was considering a strategic partnership with a respected local competitor whose CEO owed me a favor. The rumor rattled the markets. Investors called. The board demanded a meeting. In that meeting, quietly, David and my allies produced documentation that the trust protected Evelyn's assets and that any attempt to forcibly transfer her shares would be met with legal injunctions. Isabella blinked. Leo folded. For a moment, a delicious, fragile moment, their confidence wavered. They would recover, certainly. They would sharpen their tactics. But I had made them spend capital, attention, time, and reputation. And sometimes, a spent opponent is the beginning of an advantage. That night, as rain rattled the windows, I sat alone with Evelyn's letter. I read her words again: use these tools, my love. Fight for the life we built. Her handwriting looked alive on the page, fierce with the dignity that had always been her armor. I felt small, and then larger, the way a person does when they remember how deeply two lives can bind: love, strategy, and an iron will combined. Tomorrow, I would call my old foreman and ask for a list of keys. But first, I would place a call to someone who had once loved Leo like a brother, a quiet man who kept things in his head like a squirrel keeps nuts. There would be more chess to play. The board was set.